Open your Bibles, if you would, to Matthew chapter 14 as we continue our study in the Gospel of Matthew. As we got to verse 21 in our previous study, Jesus had fed a multitude that just numbering the men numbered at 5,000. And so there was this incredible miracle where Jesus took a very little and turned it into not just a lot, but more than enough that everyone ate until they were satisfied, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers. Matthew continues the narrative in verse 22 when he says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away." If you were reading the parallel in John chapter 6, you'd find out that because of this miracle of being fed, the crowd gets really excited and they began to desire Jesus to be king. In fact, they were trying to insist that he would be king even against his will. And so you see this brevity in Matthew and this swiftness that Jesus separates the disciples from the crowd and even the crowd from himself, because he's not interested in being a king. Now, I would assume, kind of knowing where or at least reading where the disciples' state of mind has been along the way, that when they heard the crowd begin to say that this Jesus should be our king, I would think that's something that the disciples would be excited about, they'd be positive about, and they'd be like, yeah, we're definitely in favor of that. And that's not, however, where Jesus is headed. It's not his goal or desire to rule as king, but rather to offer his life as a sacrifice on the cross. So he cuts that off pretty quickly and separates the disciples from that influence in verse 22. He does send away the crowd, though, with at least a full stomach. You remember as the struggle began and Jesus is pointing out the need for people to eat, the disciples' response is merely to send people away. Well, Jesus does that, not because they're hungry, he can take care of that, but because they want him to be king, which is not appropriate or according to the will of God. In verse 23, after he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, and when it was evening, he was there alone. This is what we saw Jesus attempt to do all the way back in verse 13. For having received the news of John the Baptist's execution, it's his desire to have some time alone, and that's why he withdraws along with the disciples, but the crowd finds him, and rather than being frustrated, he feels compassion, heals them, and serves them. That turns into a demand for kingship, and then he sends them away. So this prayer and time alone certainly takes us back to the original desire that Jesus has about comfort and just some solace after hearing about John's death. But there also now may be another layer to this prayer because he's just faced a very serious temptation. You remember when we were studying in chapter 4 that Satan came to Jesus and tempted him, said, turn these stones to bread, and Jesus said no. And we sort of see in John 6 how that plays out. This producing of bread makes people, it meets their physical needs and gets them excited about a physical kingdom rather than a spiritual one. But in Old's temptation, Satan also says, if you'll fall down and worship me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of this world. And that's not, of course, what Jesus is about. He would later tell Pilate in the Gospel of John that my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, my servants would fight. It's always been about the kingdom of heaven as we work through those parables just in the last couple of chapters. And so what Jesus is focused on is leading people to the spiritual kingdom. And so as Satan tempted Jesus in chapter 4, we noticed in Luke 4 in that parallel that Luke said that when Satan left, he left for a more opportune time, which means he would come back. This would be a consistent temptation that Satan would offer, and we see it again right here. And so I would think part of this prayer in verse 23 is again about focus and about strength to live out the path and to be the Messiah that God intends, the Father intends for him to be. In verse 24, so while Jesus is praying and he's there alone in verse 24, the disciples are struggling. It says, but the boat was already a long distance from land, battered by the waves, for the wind was against them. In fact, verse 25, they're in the fourth watch of the night, which would be between 3 and 6 a.m. So they have been in this boat all night. Rather than a decent trip across the lake, it's taken them all night, and they are struggling. In fact, it says in verse 24 that they were battered by the waves or distressed by the waves. So it's not been just a simple delay, but it's been an intense struggle. And so when you put yourself in their sandals, you understand that you would be tired, that you would be likely cold and wet. This is not going to be a sealed boat. If there's a storm, there's going to be waves. If there's waves, there's going to be spray. And so you're talking about really uncomfortable. You're talking about exhausted. You're talking about tired. There's also the struggle that we know that 4 of them know their way around a boat, being former fishermen. But we know there's other disciples that would have not been handy, likely at all, in a boat. Matthew's a tax collector, for example. I don't imagine him being very handy. So being in a crisis, or at least a struggle, with ill-equipped people would add a whole nother layer of struggle and frustration and stress as well. So in verse 25, Jesus comes to them in this darkest of the night before dawn, and he's walking on the sea. Now, Jesus has already gotten into a boat with them and has already stilled a storm. They've already been in a situation where Jesus was asleep in the back of the boat, and they wake him up, and they say, "Don't you care? We're perishing. The boat's filling full of water. We're about to sink. We're all going to die." And then Jesus says, "Hush, be still," and he stills the storm. So the disciples have seen already Jesus do incredible things. Just in our chapter alone, Jesus' miracles have been so known, so public, that in the first part of the chapter, when Herod hears about it, that's what started that whole guilty conscience about maybe Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. The reason that crowds are flocking to Jesus is because of the miracles. So the disciples have been exposed to miracle after miracle after miracle. How long would it take, or what does it take, when you're watching Jesus heal the sick and heal lepers? They've seen him still a storm. They've seen him raise someone from the dead. At some point, either A, are you no longer amazed, because B, you begin to understand that Jesus can do anything. Certainly, if he's stilled a storm for you in a boat, it seems like a close context, or at least a parallel kind of challenge that they could have had some sort of positive expectations. I say all of that because the reaction in verse 26 is interesting. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. Why? Well, I understand in a normal situation, you're in the storm, it's dark, and all of a sudden there's someone out there that shouldn't be. There's no rational or reasonable explanation. That all makes sense. It's unlikely that Jesus was glowing in the dark. If he can walk on water, he can glow if he wants to. But it's more likely that he has been as they know him, and so he's not doing any of that, but he could have been seen in a flash of lightning, or perhaps some moonlight breaks through the cloud cover, or maybe they're finally close enough that they can see him in the gloom. But what I find interesting, so in a natural circumstance, certainly you would be terrified because this doesn't make sense. But this isn't their first trip with Jesus. They've been in a boat and in a storm, and they've watched him still the storm. They have seen him heal people and do various miracles. They're just coming out of a miracle where he's fed a multitude with just a handful of food. And so I guess my question is, at what point do they just decide that whatever happens, Jesus is taking care of them? So if you roll back the tape just a little bit, is it reasonable to think while they're struggling and fighting the storm, isn't it reasonable that maybe one of them might have said out loud, "Boy, I wish Jesus was here," right? I mean, and maybe another one could have easily said, "Boy, that's right. I mean, I wished he was here like he was last time, and he could just still this storm, and we wouldn't have to be doing this." It seems like a very natural thing to think, for sure, but certainly to say, to have a discussion. Where is Jesus? These are men of prayer. These are men who've grown up in faith, praying to God. And so especially some of those who are not as comfortable perhaps in such a setting, did none of them pray? Did none of them at least say, "I wish Jesus was here"? And so it's interesting that when they see Jesus, their first thought is to be afraid, and their first thought is to say it is a ghost. That's the only explanation they can come up with, is we're seeing a phantasma or a spiritual apparition, that we're seeing some sort of unearthly thing. Why don't at least one of them say, maybe it's Jesus? At some point, when do we allow Jesus and God in general to be bigger than our box of what we expect or what we understand or what we can appreciate? As we follow God, at what point do our prayers become larger, or at least leave room for the power of God. For when we say, thy will be done, not mine, then whatever God wants to do, what if it's either not just simply what we don't want, but what if it's beyond our ability to even comprehend? Isn't that a reasonable explanation or expectation that God is going to be larger than our ability to comprehend what he would do, why he would do it, how he would do it? So at some point, it would have been nice if the disciples, likely, I would think, probably, I would think, that one of them has said to the other, I wish Jesus was here. And one of them said, yeah, I mean, last time he stilled the storm. Remember when he was asleep and we're like, wow, I can't believe he sleeps through this. That has to have been in a natural setting, some kind of conversation. And then when Jesus does come, when there is an answer to that desire or an answer to that probable prayer, they don't recognize him. Because the mindset is already, there's no way Jesus could be there because, see, they're out in the middle of this water by themselves. I mean, I guess Jesus could have come if it had his own boat, but they knew he didn't have a boat. So if they had seen a boat approaching, maybe they could have said, hey, maybe that's Jesus. But their faith is not yet complete enough to be able to accept Jesus arriving however he chooses to accept Jesus doing whatever he chooses to do, however he chooses to do it. So they cry out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Jesus' point or his mission here is not to frighten them, is not to chastise them, but to help them. Mark adds that Jesus approaches them because he sees them straining at the oars. He knows they're distressed. He knows that they're battered by the waves. He knows that they're afraid. So he begins to speak. They didn't recognize his form, I don't think because he was disguised in any way, but rather they didn't expect to see him out there in the middle of the water. I think there's some point when we could reasonably expect they could have at least given it a maybe. But certainly when he begins to speak, they would recognize his voice. Take courage, it is I. It's me. It's Jesus. And then, of course, the encouragement, don't be afraid. In this particular case, they're not afraid of the storm. They're tired, they're worn out, they're exhausted, but they're afraid of him. They think he's a ghost. They're afraid of what he appears or how he appears to them. Peter in verse 28 said to Jesus, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. The other disciples are afraid, and Peter launches out in faith to confirm that, which I always think is fascinating. They're in the dark, they're in a storm. This is long before days of life jackets and the flashing strobe lights and the personal GPS locating beacons and all of that. For what Peter is proposing, he would well know from his background as a fisherman. Because just like fishermen, even today, with all of our modern technology, we still have the occasional seaman or fisherman be lost in a storm or in an accident. Once you go into the water, when a boat is already struggling, the chances of rescue, even now with life jackets and beacons and GPS locators and all of that, the problem is, if the boat is struggling in the weather, it's not like they can just turn around and go get you. The boat's already struggling for survival. In fact, what likely we're seeing here is a situation where they're going to have a mast and a sail, but since the wind is against them, the only way that they could hold position or hold the boat in its relatively safe position of facing the waves. Boats get in trouble when they turn sideways and the wave gets under them and starts to roll them, or if the wave gets behind them and lifts the stern. The way a boat is made, facing the waves is always the best in a storm. Only way they can do that is if they get on the oars and they use the oars to just hold the boat in position. They're certainly not going to make any progress to speak of. They don't have that kind of horsepower to push through the waves like a modern boat would. It's just about holding position. So Peter's the most educated and the most experienced. He's probably one of the strongest men in the boat. So what he's proposing in any other circumstance would be absolute suicide. To leave the boat and get into the water, if they're barely holding position, and they've got, like I said, 4 experienced men in that boat, and one of the 4 is about to jump ship, literally, there's no way that they're going to be able to maneuver that boat in those conditions. They're barely holding the boat even. facing into the waves, no doubt. But to try to go maneuver to find somebody, and it's in the dark, and once he goes in the water with the pitching waves, they're going to lose sight of him in seconds. So the very thing that Peter's saying is just crazy. But what Peter's doing is walking by faith and not by sight. Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 later that that's how we live. We live by our trust in the Lord, not with our understanding. In other words, we don't look across the world with our eyes and we say, okay, well, this is what makes sense, but rather we trust Jesus. Because it doesn't make sense that you can feed a multitude with a handful of food. Your eyes tell you that that's not enough food. But faith says, I don't know how, but I know Jesus. And then Jesus takes care of it. And the same here. Peter trusts Jesus. It doesn't seem to me that in verse 28 that this is an experiment or Peter's not really sure, so it's a way to test Jesus, because all Jesus simply says in verse 29 is come. And Jesus is only going to give merit to that which is faithful. This is not an experiment or a trick or some kind of joke, but rather there is a genuine faith in Peter. So rather than the sight of, safety's in the boat, don't get out in the storm, his faith is, I want to be where Jesus is. Now, if I had been in the boat, and I would be probably like the other 11 disciples, I would have been saying something like, Jesus, why don't you come and get on our boat and still the storm? We've seen that before. Why don't you come fix this? What Peter does is, I don't need you to fix it, I just need to be where you are. See, there's no discussion of, Jesus, will you still the storm? Jesus, will you save the boat? Jesus, will you get us to the other side? All Peter says is, can I go to you? And where Jesus is standing, there's nothing positive about it. At least not in the first glance, right? He's out in the middle of the water. He's out in the middle of the storm. So this would make very little sense unless what Peter is saying is, I know it's you. I trust you. That's why I want to be where you are. And so Jesus offers the simple command, come. I take great comfort in the fact that verse 29 says, and Peter got out of the boat and he walked on water and came toward Jesus. That he was able to do exactly what Jesus said. In other words, Jesus will never give us a command that he doesn't provide the way. It's not about trapping us. It's not about torturing us. It's not about tricking us. But Jesus is about providing for us, especially if our goal is to come to him. That's the thing he wants more than anything. So whenever there's anything between us and Jesus, no matter how much sense it makes or how large the obstacle seems, that whenever there's a barrier or a problem or a challenge and we're frightened by that or we're paralyzed by that and we say it's just too much, it's too far, it's too big, I've messed up too much, I'm too far gone, I can't become that kind of person. There's all kinds of storms that get between us and Jesus. What Peter and Jesus show us, if we want to come to Jesus, he will absolutely make it possible, that there is no barrier that can exist between us. Later, Paul would say at the end of Romans 8 that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ, that not even death itself is a barrier that can keep us from Jesus. So when Peter says, I want to come to you, and you notice he says, you command me, because he seems to understand that Jesus will have to have the authority, that it's not just Peter's wishful thinking, it will require the authority of Jesus for this to be possible. So he's walking by faith and not by sight. He trusts in Jesus and begins to go against everything he would know. He's probably the most experienced and knowledgeable person about such a context of boat and water and storms, but he trusts Jesus the most. In verse 30, but seeing the wind, he became frightened. For some reason, every time I read this text, it makes me think of the children of Israel when they are being led out of Egypt after having lived through the 10 different plagues and then the pillar of fire and smoke. When they get up against the Red Sea, they're trapped by Pharaoh's army. Right before they're going to be annihilated as an unarmed group of ex or former slaves fleeing from the wrath of the leading superpower of the region in their military, God parts the water of the Red Sea and they cross on dry land. And I've always wondered what it's like when you're going through this valley of water, that the ground you walk on is dry, though it is just a few moments ago was a seabed, now it's dry land. It's not even muddy. So you're crossing it with ease, but you're looking at water. I just Can't help but wonder if ever there was a time where they just looked and began to worry about, this isn't possible, so when does it stop being impossible? When does the water go back to do what it does? When do we get drowned here trying to cross the Red Sea? Peter is having his Red Sea moment. He's crossing on dry land to the promised land. He's crossing to Jesus. But he starts looking around. Where he's been walking by faith, he begins to use his sight and see what can't be done. I don't know what it is about us, but we have a knack, we have an ability to really focus on negative things. We can work ourselves into our own anxieties and our own fear loops where we can start worrying about things. Much earlier, Jesus had already taught us to not worry about the morrow at the end of chapter 6, that each day has enough trouble of its own, that we are to be like the birds or are to be like the flowers of the field, knowing that God provides. But there's something about how we can get in our own intellect and start spinning, and we can give incredibly long lists of reasons and justifications for our fears and our concerns. And I guess the irony is those lists can be quite accurate. It's not like, sometimes we worry about things that are just ludicrous, like, well, I hope the moon never slips and runs into us, we'd all be doomed. Well, okay, if gravity stops working, I guess we're in trouble. But then there's other things that you can put a pencil to, and it makes sense, and you can add up the ones and zeros, and sure enough, that's a bad thing, or it's a troubling thing. It may even be an impossible thing. We need to be aware of the challenges, but when we focus on them, we lose sight of who Jesus is. It's interesting how we can get in a loop where we spend more time looking at what's real rather than what's true. What I mean by that is, it is a real storm. The boat really is battered. They really are exhausted. But Jesus is really the Son of God, the creator of the universe, the almighty Messiah. There's nothing that he can't handle. That's what's true is about who Jesus is. We too can focus so much on the storm that we can become paralyzed. And that's what happens to Peter. Now, the other disciples have continued apparently to be looking at the wind. They never got past that. Peter did. But then he's overwhelmed by his vision. Seeing the wind, he became frightened and beginning to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." This is still faith, though, because his focus is still on Jesus. He's overwhelmed. You might say he begins to realize what he's doing doesn't make sense, and it becomes a matter of intellect rather than faith. But when he's sinking, because remember now his fate is severe. In any other normal circumstance, there's no way Peter doesn't drown here. It's too far to swim back to the shore. The boat is going to drift much, much faster than somebody in the water trying to get back to the boat and their ability to maneuver it. All of that is to say he's really in trouble. But with all of that ingrained instinct, you'll notice that Peter doesn't turn back to the boat. He doesn't swim madly for the boat. He doesn't yell, "Stick an oar out, let me get a hold of it." He doesn't yell for them to try to come to him and rescue him. Even in his sinking, I'm tempted to say failure, and I guess that's accurate because now he's not walking, he's sinking. But he's so far ahead of the other disciples. He's the only one out of the boat. And even in his sinking, he's still focused on Jesus. He cries out to Jesus for deliverance. Jesus is the only one that can save him. Perhaps one of the most beautiful words in this particular text is the first of verse 31, when Matthew says immediately. This is where sometimes Satan gets in our heart and creates the doubt, not only that, hey, this storm is bigger than Jesus, hey, you're not going to make this, and that creates a doubt, takes our eyes off of Jesus. But sometimes even as we're beginning to sink, there's this whisper that Satan sometimes would whisper to our heart that we're a failure and that Jesus is sick of us. And he's told us, if he's told us once, he's told us 1,000,000 times, that he gets in our heart trying to get us to not cry out to Jesus. To paint in our minds this image that Jesus is done with us, that he's impatient with us, that he's no longer going to offer forgiveness and grace. What Matthew says, as soon as Peter begins to sink, he cries out, "Lord, save me." And then he says, immediately Jesus is there. Immediately He's there. I like the connection of the words, in beginning to sink. I don't know, and he doesn't get that specific. I just wonder how far Peter sank. It's not like Peter was going under and the waves were roaring over his head and he fights to the surface and he spits out a mouthful of water and yells only to go back under and gurgle and he goes down again and he fights and he goes up and then he gets shoved again under the water by the waves and now he's starting to inhale some water and he's just about to die and it's kind of this dying gasp. And no, the way the text reads is that as he begins to sink, it doesn't take him long to realize that he needs Jesus, and that as soon as he cries out, in fact, immediately as he cries out, Jesus stretches out his hand and gets hold of him. The third word here, we've got beginning to sink, we've got immediately, and then we've got Jesus stretched, which means it wasn't that Peter closed the distance. It wasn't that as Peter was sinking, he somehow lunged forward and like grabbed Jesus by an ankle. There's nothing that Peter could do to save himself. He's in a quagmire. He's sinking. He's going down. There's no way he's capable of movement. So what Jesus does is Jesus stretches. It's not like Peter stretched out and just got a hold of one sandal. No. Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him. Jesus covered the distance. Jesus closed the gap. In fact, Jesus is the one who came all the way from heaven to earth to grab hold of us and save us, because we can never reach that far. But Jesus can. In fact, he's the only one that can. He took a hold of him and he said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Not as chastisement, but to build his faith. It's not that Peter didn't believe. It's not that Peter is an atheist. It's not that Peter had no faith, but it's the corrosive effect that doubt has on faith. It's not that he's become an unbeliever. You don't have to become an unbeliever for your relationship with Christ to stall. You don't have to become an unbeliever to begin to sink. It just requires enough doubt to cause anxiety. For in our anxiety, we begin to go into that loop of the what ifs and what do we need to do. And all of that is this idea of what am I going to do and self-reliance and what's going to happen. And that's rejecting the sovereignty of Christ in our life. That he can feed the multitude, that he can supply every need, that he can still every storm. That's where our confidence comes from, is our faith in him. So Peter has faith. And he did reach out to Jesus even in his sinking. But what Jesus is saying is, or he's reminding Peter and us about the corrosive effects of doubt on faith. That it may not even necessarily erase faith, but it paralyzes faith. It inhibits faith. So that we are not able to walk on water. We may not be at the boat, but we're not walking on water either. In verse 32, when they got into the boat, the wind stopped. That's the second time they've seen Jesus still a storm. The last time, or the first time, they woke Jesus up, and, don't you care that we're all dying here? And Jesus gets up and says, "Hush, be still, peace, be still," and the storm is stilled. This time, Jesus doesn't even say anything. If there were any voices or any thoughts earlier about, I wish Jesus was here. The last time we were in a place like this, he just stilled the storm. He does again. Not only does Jesus rescue Peter, but he rescues all of them. He stills the storm for all of them. If Peter had little faith, or if Peter had a faith that had been corroded or diluted by doubt, what does that say about the other disciples? They don't even get out of the boat. They don't even speak to Jesus. They don't say, "Is that really you?" If it's you. They don't even have that conversation. They seem to be just frozen. And still, Jesus calms the storm for all of them. One of the fun details that John adds in chapter 6 is the other thing that Jesus does is in that moment the boat is also at their destination. They spent all night battling the storm, rowing against it, in this terrible situation, totally exhausted, totally overwhelmed. They see Jesus. They don't rightly understand that it's him. They're afraid of him, and yet Peter is drawn to Jesus. He has his sinking moment. Jesus calms the storm, and then the boat is where they were trying to get, that he not only removes the storm, but he also closes the distance. As he stretched out to Peter and rescued him, he also stretches out and moves them to where they wanted to be. In verse 33, those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "You are certainly God's Son." Can't imagine, I guess, the disorientation of, he's walking on water. Wow. He's got Peter walking on water. Wow. He rescued Peter. Well, maybe they had mixed feelings about that. The storm is over. Wow. We're at the shoreline. Wow. At some point, the disciples and you and I have to learn to the point that we can decide that Jesus is sufficient. That whether we don't have any food, or whether we're in a battering storm, or whether we're facing death itself, that Jesus can provide everything we need. When they'd crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent word into all the surrounding district. And they brought to him all who were sick, and they begged him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak, and as many as touched it were cured. Already Matthew has said several statements about this, like this, where miracles are just happening everywhere. All the more, why when they see Jesus walking on the water, can they not conceive of the idea that if he can do all these things, why couldn't he walk on the water? Why couldn't he walk through a storm to answer their prayer? That when they no doubt said, "I wish Jesus was here," what's going to keep him from doing that? What's going to prevent that? What barrier will Jesus not be able to penetrate? And as we struggle, what's going to keep Jesus from stretching out his hand and getting hold of us? His reach is always long enough. It's the way Isaiah says it is, the Lord's arm so shortened that he cannot save us. No, Jesus can stretch out his hand as far as is needed to rescue us from anywhere, anything, anytime. There'll be a discussion in the next chapter between Jesus and the Pharisees as they struggle to accept who he is. And then we get into one of the strangest conversations with this Syrophoenician woman in verse 21 of chapter 15. Jesus has a conversation with what seems like a humble, simple, and innocent lady whose request seems to be quite honorable and pure and good. And the conversation Jesus has with her is odd. There's no other conversation like it in our Bibles between Jesus and someone in need. So we'll look forward to getting into that. But as we go from this place and this study, let's be encouraged that Jesus can stretch out his hand far enough to help us. Would you pray with me as we conclude? Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to open your word. We're grateful, Lord, for your faithfulness, for your power, for your ability and willingness to walk through any storm and to stretch across any barrier to help us. So, Lord, help us that our faith would grow, that we would be free from anxiety, and that we would have joy and peace. We thank you for your patience and for your grace. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.